The most dangerous mistake in the galaxy was never underestimating a weapon. It was underestimating the world that forged the one holding it. The lecture hall inside the Galactic Academy of Interstellar Sciences could comfortably seat nearly 4,000 cadets. Yet on that particular morning, it felt strangely smaller beneath the immense, transparent dome that revealed a river of distant stars flowing silently across the darkness. Brilliant white light poured through suspended crystal panels, illuminating rows upon rows of young officers from more than 100 civilizations. Floating holographic projectors rotated above the central platform, displaying detailed planetary models, while soft mechanical hums blended with the quiet tapping of digital notebooks. Professor Selena Kryn stood alone at the center of the circular stage, her elegant silver instructor uniform perfectly pressed, her pale gray eyes calmly scanning the enormous audience before her. Years of scientific exploration had earned her respect throughout the Alliance, and few questioned her conclusions when she spoke. Behind her, a brilliant blue hologram slowly expanded until an entire planet floated above the classroom floor. Oceans shimmered beneath swirling white clouds. Vast continents drifted across the sphere, while tiny flashes of lightning flickered inside enormous storm systems. Every cadet watched the projection with silent fascination. Professor Kryn folded her hands behind her back before speaking in the measured voice that had shaped generations of explorers. Today's lesson concerns Category 9 planetary environments. These worlds possess combinations of gravity, atmosphere, weather, biology, and geological instability that exceed acceptable survival parameters for Academy personnel. The hologram slowly rotated. Mountains rose higher than clouds. Endless oceans reflected sunlight across half the sphere. Hurricanes stretched hundreds of miles across the surface, while volcanic activity glowed beneath drifting cloud formations. Scientific data scrolled beside the image. Atmospheric oxygen concentration, variable climate zone, seismic activity, complex microbial ecosystems, apex predators, seasonal temperature extremes. Every new line made the classroom quieter. Professor Kryn allowed several moments for the information to settle before continuing. Historical simulations indicate that no Academy cadet could survive prolonged exposure to a world with environmental conditions matching this profile. Several alien cadets exchanged uneasy glances. One quietly whispered, "It is beautiful." Another answered just as softly, "It is impossible." The professor nodded toward the hologram. Its common designation is Earth. The name drifted through the enormous lecture hall like an unfamiliar legend. A few cadets immediately began searching historical archives through their tablets. Others simply stared at the rotating planet with growing disbelief. The gravity alone exceeded what many civilizations considered safe for permanent settlement. Then there were the oceans, the storms, the unpredictable climates, the countless microorganisms invisible to the naked eye, and the astonishing variety of animal life. The data seemed less like a scientific report and more like a warning. Professor Kryn calmly concluded, "No Academy cadet could survive on a world like this." Silence followed. Thousands of students accepted the statement without hesitation, until a single hand quietly rose near the middle of the lecture hall. It was neither rushed nor dramatic. It simply lifted with calm confidence. Professor Kryn noticed it immediately. Around the raised hand, nearby cadets slowly turned in surprise. The young human sitting among them remained perfectly composed. Ethan Walker wore the standard Navy Academy cadet uniform like everyone else, his blonde hair neatly trimmed, his blue eyes fixed respectfully on the professor. There was no challenge in his expression, no attempt to embarrass anyone, only quiet certainty. Professor Kryn acknowledged him with a small nod. "Yes, cadet." Ethan stood slowly. Thousands of curious eyes settled upon him beneath the brilliant Academy lights. He glanced once toward the floating image of Earth before looking back at the professor. His voice never rose above ordinary conversation. "Then explain me. The words were astonishing precisely because they carried no anger. The holographic Earth continued turning in complete silence above the platform, while the entire lecture hall seemed to forget how to breathe. Professor Kryn looked from a young human to the impossible planet suspended between them. For the first time in many years, the certainty of an entire lesson encountered a single living question standing quietly in the middle of the classroom. 1 week earlier, before anyone questioned the impossible, Ethan Walker arrived at the Galactic Academy of Interstellar Sciences carrying nothing more remarkable than a weathered travel case and a quiet determination to learn. The Academy floated above a tranquil ringed world where artificial gravity remained perfectly constant, temperatures never varied by more than 3 degrees, and every environmental system was designed to eliminate unnecessary risk. The station itself reflected the philosophy shared by nearly every advanced civilization. Stability created progress. Predictability created safety. Ethan noticed those details almost immediately. The corridors remained spotless without effort. The air carried the same comfortable humidity every hour of the day. Even the gardens beneath the transparent domes bloomed according to carefully programmed seasonal cycles rather than unpredictable weather. Alien cadets admired the engineering with obvious pride. Ethan admired it as well, but he quietly found himself missing things no one else seemed to notice. He missed the smell of rain arriving before storm. He missed leaves moving beneath changing winds. He even missed mornings that began with cloudy skies and ended beneath bright sunshine. Earth had taught him that nature rarely asked permission before changing its mind. During orientation week, instructors introduced cadets to the Academy's extensive curriculum. Stella Navigación, planetary engineering, first contact diplomacy, environmental adaptation. Ethan listened carefully to every presentation while taking detailed notes with the same discipline that had carried him through years of demanding study back home. He never attempted to become the center of attention. Whenever classmates debated which species possessed the greatest physical endurance or the most advanced technology, Ethan usually remained silent. He preferred listening before speaking. His roommates gradually noticed another unusual habit. Every morning before breakfast, Ethan completed a short physical workout on an observation deck overlooking open space. Not because Academy regulations required it, but because routine had always helped him remain focused. One morning, another cadet approached him with genuine curiosity. "Why train before classes begin?" Ethan smiled while catching his breath. "Because some habits are easier to keep than rebuild." The answer seemed ordinary enough, yet it stayed with the other cadet long after the conversation ended. Throughout the first week, Professor Selena Kryn quietly observed every incoming class. She rarely remembered names immediately, but she always remembered patterns. One student constantly volunteered unnecessary opinions. Another interrupted lectures, searching for recognition. A third challenged instructors simply to attract attention. Ethan belonged to none of those groups. He arrived early. He listened carefully. He thanked laboratory technicians after every exercise. When another cadet accidentally dropped a stack of planetary survey tablets across the library floor, Ethan knelt without hesitation to help collect them before returning to his own assignment. Most people never realized he had done it. That suited him perfectly. By the end of the week, Professor Kryn finalized her lesson plan for the Advanced Environmental Survival course. She intended to challenge assumptions about planetary safety by examining several Category 9 worlds considered unsuitable for long-term habitation. The final lecture focused on one world in particular, Earth. Historical records described extraordinary gravity compared with most inhabited planets. Constant geological activity reshaped continents over millions of years. Violent weather systems crossed thousands of miles without warning. Oceans covered most of the surface. Complex microorganisms surrounded every living creature. Countless animal species competed for survival within ecosystems of astonishing diversity. Scientific models consistently classified Earth as an environment far beyond acceptable Academy standards. Professor Kryn reviewed every chart twice before approving the presentation. The data contained no obvious errors. Every statistic came from verified exploration reports. Yet one variable never appeared inside the calculations. A young human quietly sitting in the middle rows of her classroom who had spent his entire childhood calling that impossible world home. As the morning lecture approached, Ethan carried his digital notebook into the enormous hall exactly as he had done every day before. He expected another lesson. Professor Corinne expected another lecture supported by reliable science. Neither of them realized that within the next hour, one simple question would begin changing how an entire academy understood the meaning of survival. Professor Selena Corinne remained perfectly still after Ethan Walker spoke. Around them, the immense lecture hall seemed suspended outside of time while the holographic Earth continued its slow rotation above the central platform. Brilliant blue oceans shimmered beneath swirling cloud systems. Mountain ranges cast long shadows across continents. Flush storms drifted silently over open water. Every scientific measurement displayed beside the planet remained unchanged, yet the meaning behind those numbers suddenly felt uncertain. Thousands of cadets shifted their attention from the hologram to the young human standing quietly among them. Ethan showed no sign of satisfaction. He had not intended to challenge the professor. He had only answered the conclusion presented before the class with the one piece of evidence he could never ignore: himself. Professor Corinne finally broke the silence. Cadet Walker. Yes, Professor. You were born on Earth? Yes, Professor. You lived there continuously before entering this academy? Yes, Professor. Her pale gray eyes narrowed thoughtfully rather than skeptically. For how many years? 22. A soft wave of whispers moved across the lecture hall before disappearing almost as quickly as it had begun. Several cadets instinctively opened their tablets, comparing Ethan's calm appearance with the environmental statistics floating beside the planetary model. Nothing about him matched what they expected from someone raised on a world described as nearly impossible to survive. Professor Corinne touched the holographic controls, and the display expanded. New information appeared beside Earth. Surface gravity, atmospherique composition, seasonal variation, ocean coverage, seismic activity, biological diversity. She pointed toward the first line. Earth's gravity exceeds the Academy comfort standard by more than 30%. Ethan nodded politely. That sounds correct. She continued. Average weather patterns change rapidly across multiple climate regions. Yes, Professor. Lightning storms occur regularly. Yes, Professor. Millions of microorganisms exist in every natural environment. Ethan smiled faintly, more than most people realize. A few cadets exchanged uncertain looks. They had expected hesitation. Instead, they heard quiet confirmation after quiet confirmation. Professor Corinne continued through the list. Large predators developed naturally across multiple ecosystems. Yes, Professor. Earth contains deserts, frozen polar regions, dense forests, mountain ranges above 20,000 feet, deep oceans, and active volcanoes. Ethan answered exactly as before. Yes, Professor. The professor slowly lowered her hand. And you consider that normal? Ethan looked up at the rotating planet. For several seconds, he simply watched white clouds drift across familiar continents. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. I considered it home. The words carried no pride. They carried memory. For the first time since the lecture began, the enormous hall became completely silent again. Professor Corinne studied Ethan carefully. She had expected someone defending their species to exaggerate achievements or argue against unfavorable data. Instead, the young human accepted every scientific observation without disagreement. He challenged only the conclusion. She spoke again, her voice noticeably quieter. Did your family ever discuss living somewhere safer? Ethan gently shook his head. Earth was never dangerous because we lived there. It was simply where life taught us how to adapt. Those words lingered throughout the lecture hall. Nearby cadets stopped typing. Even the automated transcription system seemed almost reluctant to interrupt the silence with blinking text. Professor Kryn slowly walked toward the holographic Earth until its blue light reflected across her silver uniform. According to current Academy models, she said thoughtfully, long-term survival under these combined conditions should require extraordinary biological specialization. Ethan answered with complete sincerity. Perhaps it did. The professor looked back at him. Explain. Ethan folded his hands behind his back before speaking. We did not become human first and then survive Earth. We became who we are because Earth never stopped asking us to adapt. No one whispered this time. No one searched for another statistic. The statement did not reject science. It invited everyone in the room to look at the same evidence from an entirely different direction. Professor Kryn slowly turned once more toward the floating world above the platform. For years, she had taught that Earth represented an impossible environment. Standing quietly in the middle rows of her classroom was living proof that impossible worlds sometimes created the very species capable of calling them home. Professor Selena Kryn did not continue the lecture immediately. Instead, she dismissed the planetary statistics with a simple gesture, allowing the floating numbers surrounding Earth to disappear one by one until only the blue world remained suspended beneath the Academy dome. Without the endless columns of measurements, the planet looked strangely peaceful. White clouds drifted across brilliant oceans, while sunlight slowly crossed familiar continents. Ethan Walker quietly watched the hologram. Recognizing coastlines he had once flown over with his parents during summer vacations in mountain ranges, where he had learned that weather forecasts often became suggestions instead of promises. Around him, thousands of cadets remained unusually silent. Their curiosity had replaced certainty. Professor Kryn finally spoke again. Cadet Walker, remain after class. Ethan nodded respectfully. Yes, Professor. She looked across the enormous lecture hall. The remainder of today's lesson will continue inside the Environmental Adaptation Laboratory. The announcement surprised several instructors seated along the observation balcony. That laboratory was normally reserved for advanced research teams rather than first-year cadets. Within minutes, the enormous class moved through polished silver corridors toward one of the Academy's most sophisticated simulation facilities. Transparent observation walls revealed carefully controlled environments representing dozens of planetary ecosystems. Some chambers reproduced thin atmospheres. Others generated extreme humidity, heavy gravity, freezing temperatures, or intense solar radiation. Every condition remained completely safe while accurately reproducing environmental stress. Professor Kryn stopped beside a circular simulation room where soft blue lights illuminated the entrance. Today, she explained calmly, we will examine adaptation rather than theory. Cadets quietly gathered behind the observation barrier as laboratory technicians activated the first demonstration. A digital display identified the chamber as moderate Earth baseline. Gravity adjusted slightly upward. Air pressure increased. Humidity rose. Artificial wind began circulating through the enclosed space while natural sounds of distant rain and rustling trees filled the room. Several alien cadets instinctively glanced toward the environmental monitors with obvious concern. To them, the numbers already seemed unusually demanding. Professor Kryn turned toward Ethan. Cadet Walker, would you participate? Of course, Professor. Ethan stepped into the chamber without hesitation. The transparent doors closed quietly behind him before the simulation stabilized. He looked around the room with a faint smile. Nothing inside resembled danger. If anything, the moving air felt pleasantly familiar. The gentle scent of damp soil released through the environmental system reminded him of spring mornings after overnight rain back home. He inhaled slowly, almost unconsciously. Outside the chamber, one cadet whispered, "He looks comfortable." Another answered, "More than comfortable." Ethan adjusted the sleeves of his academy uniform before casually stretching his shoulders as though preparing for an ordinary walk outside. Professor Kryn observed every movement. There was no visible strain in his posture. No elevated breathing. No hesitation. Laboratory sensors displayed steady heart rate, normal oxygen consumption, balanced coordination, and complete physiological stability. A technician quietly confirmed the readings. All measurements remain well within expected human ranges. Professor Kryn nodded thoughtfully before increasing the simulation slightly. Wind intensified. Temperature shifted several degrees. Humidity continued rising. Gentle rainfall appeared inside the chamber, tapping softly against nearby stone and surrounding vegetation designed to imitate a simple earth woodland. Ethan tilted his face upward for a brief moment, allowing a few drops of water to fall across his forehead. Then he smiled. It smells like home after a summer storm. The observation gallery became silent once again. Several cadets stared not at the environmental monitors, but at Ethan himself. They had expected endurance. Instead, they witnessed recognition. Professor Kryn slowly folded her hands behind her back. "Cadet Walker," she asked through the chamber communication system, "what are you experiencing?" Ethan looked around naturally before answering. "Fresh air, moisture, a little breeze. Honestly, Professor, this would have been considered a pleasant afternoon where I grew up." A few quiet laughs escaped from the back rows, not out of mockery, but genuine disbelief. Professor Kryn did not laugh. She watched the human standing peacefully inside conditions that Academy science had long described as unusually demanding. For the first time since beginning her research career, she wondered whether every conclusion she had drawn about Earth had described only the planet itself, while completely overlooking the remarkable species that had evolved alongside it. Professor Selena Kryn remained beside the observation window long after the first simulation ended. Around her, instructors quietly reviewed environmental readings while laboratory technicians recalibrated the chamber for additional scenarios. The digital display shifted from moderate Earth baseline to variable Earth conditions. Gravity remained unchanged, but temperature fluctuations, atmospheric moisture, changing wind patterns, and uneven terrain would now alternate automatically every few minutes. Several cadets exchanged uncertain glances. Even species accustomed to difficult environments generally evolved within stable ecological patterns. Earth appeared determined to change the rules without warning. Professor Kryn looked toward Ethan Walker. "Cadet Walker, the next sequence introduces rapid environmental transitions. You may leave the chamber at any time." Ethan nodded politely. "Understood, Professor." The transparent doors closed once more behind him. A gentle breeze disappeared almost instantly, replaced by warm sunlight pouring across artificial grass and scattered stone. Moments later, the lighting shifted as thick gray clouds rolled across the chamber ceiling. Fine rain began falling before fading into cool mist. The wind changed direction without warning, carrying the scent of pine trees before becoming dry again only minutes later. Ethan calmly adjusted his footing each time the terrain changed. He did not rush. He did not complain. He simply observed the environment and adapted his movements naturally. Outside the chamber, one cadet frowned while studying the environmental chart. How does he know what to expect? Another quietly answered, "Perhaps he does not. Perhaps he expects change itself." Professor Kryn heard the exchange, but said nothing. Her attention remained fixed on the human inside the chamber. Laboratory sensors displayed stable breathing, normal cardiovascular response, and relaxed muscle activity despite continuous environmental variation. One technician enlarged the biometric display. "Professor," his stress indicators remain almost unchanged. She looked carefully at the data before asking, "Increase environmental unpredictability within Academy safety limits." The chamber responded immediately. Wind speed varied. Temperature shifted again. The walking surface changed from firm ground to damp soil before becoming uneven stone. Ethan slowed slightly, looked down, adjusted his stride, and continued walking with the same steady rhythm. Nothing about his expression suggested frustration. Instead, curiosity appeared across his face as he quietly enjoyed recognizing familiar patterns. Through the communication system, Professor Kryn spoke. "Cadet Walker, are these conditions comfortable?" Ethan considered the question. Not always comfortable, Professor. He smiled gently while watching distant clouds drift overhead. Just familiar. The answer lingered inside the laboratory. Professor Kryn folded her hands behind her back. Explain. Ethan looked toward the observation window. Growing up on Earth teaches you something very early. The weather changes. The trail changes. Plans change. You stop expecting perfect conditions and start learning how to adjust. Several cadets slowly lowered their tablets. They were no longer collecting unusual scientific facts. They were listening to a way of thinking. Ethan continued in the same calm voice. My parents used to tell me to carry a light jacket, even when the morning sky looked clear. Sometimes we used it. Sometimes we did not. Preparing for change became more important than predicting it. Professor Kryn glanced toward the environmental graphs. Every scientific measurement accurately described Earth's instability. None of them explained the mindset created by living there. She quietly asked another question. Did Earth make life more difficult? Ethan nodded once. Sometimes. Then why remember it with affection? He looked around the chamber as another light rain drifted across the artificial landscape. Because every season taught us something different. Every challenge became part of normal life. We learned that adapting was not extraordinary. It was simply Tuesday. A few cadets smiled at the unexpected answer. Even Professor Kryn allowed the faintest expression of amusement before her thoughtful gaze returned to the data. She suddenly realized every academy model measured environmental pressure while ignoring cultural adaptation. The equations described the world with remarkable precision, yet they completely overlooked what happened to a civilization that spent thousands of generations growing alongside that world. As the simulation ended and the transparent doors quietly opened, Ethan stepped back into the laboratory exactly as he had entered, calm, respectful, and completely unaware that the most important discovery of the afternoon no longer existed inside the chamber. It had begun inside the minds of everyone watching him. That evening, long after the laboratory had emptied and the academy corridors returned to their usual quiet rhythm, Professor Selena Kryn remained alone inside the Planetary Research Archive. The enormous chamber stretched nearly 200 feet beneath a curved ceiling filled with suspended data crystals containing centuries of scientific observations collected from every explored world in the Alliance. Soft amber lighting reflected across polished metal floors, while countless holographic screens floated silently around her workstation. She removed her academy jacket, placed it carefully across the back of a chair, and reopened the complete Earth database for the first time in several years. One report after another appeared before her eyes. Surface gravity exceeded the preferred academy standard. Atmospheric pressure varied across altitude and weather systems. Seasonal temperatures shifted dramatically between regions. Tectonic movement continuously reshaped the landscape. Biological diversity surpassed nearly every comparable inhabited world. Every conclusion remained scientifically correct. Yet something no longer felt complete. She quietly replayed Ethan Walker's words inside her mind. We became who we are because Earth never stopped asking us to adapt. Professor Kryn enlarged the evolutionary timeline projected above her desk. Human civilization advanced despite floods, droughts, storms, freezing winters, scorching summers, changing coastlines, shifting ecosystems, and countless environmental surprises. The more she examined the data, the more one uncomfortable realization emerged. The Academy had always measured Earth's difficulty. It had never measured what those conditions produced. She activated a comparative analysis between humanity and several civilizations raised on remarkably stable planets. The results appeared gradually across multiple displays. Physical strength varied only modestly. Cognitive performance remained comparable. Technological development followed different but equally impressive paths. Then she reached the final category, adaptive behavioral response. Professor Kryn stopped scrolling. Humanity ranked unexpectedly high across nearly every measurable scenario involving unfamiliar environments, changing conditions, and uncertain outcomes. She requested additional verification. The archive confirmed the findings using exploration records spanning hundreds of years. Human crews consistently adjusted more rapidly after unexpected changes than species originating from environmentally stable worlds. Not because humans predicted every challenge, but because they rarely expected life to remain predictable. Professor Kryn slowly leaned back in her chair. Outside the panoramic observation window, countless stars drifted silently across the darkness while the Academy rotated peacefully above the ringed planet below. She remembered Ethan smiling inside the simulation chamber after the artificial rain began falling. Most cadets had viewed the changing weather as increasing difficulty. Ethan had viewed it as an ordinary afternoon. The distinction suddenly felt enormous. She opened the original lecture manuscript prepared for that morning. The first conclusion read exactly as she had taught it for years. No Academy cadet could survive prolonged exposure to Earth. Professor Kryn looked at the sentence for several seconds before quietly deleting it. She began typing again. Earth presents environmental conditions that continuously reward adaptation across generations. She paused. That still felt incomplete. Her fingers returned to the keyboard. Humanity is evidence that long-term survival is not determined solely by environmental severity, but also by the capacity of civilization to adapt alongside it. She stopped once more. This time the words felt closer to the truth. A soft notification interrupted her thoughts. Chief Archivist Taryn had entered the research chamber carrying a stack of historical journals. He noticed the extensive Earth data covering every display. "Working late, Professor?" She smiled faintly without looking away from the projections. "I believe I've been teaching an incomplete lesson." The archivist approached quietly. "Incorrect." Professor Kryn gently shook her head. "No, incomplete." She pointed toward the holographic Earth, turning slowly above her workstation. "We spent decades studying the planet." Her pale gray eyes reflected the blue oceans drifting across the projection. "We forgot to study what the planet shaped." The archivist followed her gaze toward the rotating world before nodding thoughtfully. Neither spoke again for several moments. The silence carried its own quiet understanding. Somewhere else inside the Academy, Ethan Walker had already returned to his dormitory after finishing another ordinary evening of homework, completely unaware that his calm honesty had begun changing a scientific belief accepted for generations. Professor Kryn saved the revised research file under a new title before shutting down the archive for the night. As the holographic Earth slowly faded into darkness, she realized the greatest discovery she had made that day was not about an extraordinary planet. It was about an ordinary young man who had never considered surviving that planet extraordinary at all. The following morning, Professor Selena Kryn stood before the Alliance Scientific Review Council carrying a single printed report instead of the holographic presentation everyone expected. The council chamber overlooked the Academy through a curved wall of transparent crystal where hundreds of cadets crossed bright courtyards beneath a carefully controlled sky. Around the circular conference table sat researchers, environmental specialists, evolutionary biologists, and senior instructors whose work had shaped Academy doctrine for decades. Most believed the meeting would simply approve the annual revision of planetary survival classifications. Few realized they were about to reconsider one of the Academy's oldest assumptions. Professor Kryn placed her report gently on the polished table before speaking. "I am requesting a revision of the current Earth survival assessment." Several council members immediately exchanged curious glances. Chancellor Darius Solon folded his hands calmly. "Your previous assessment has remained scientifically accurate for many years." Professor Kryn nodded. "The environmental measurements remain accurate." She paused briefly. "The conclusion does not." Quiet whispers spread across the chamber before fading once more. A senior planetary analyst activated the original Academy report above the table. Earth rotated slowly beside its familiar statistics. High gravity, dynamic climate, active geology, complex biology, variable weather. The analyst looked toward Professor Kryn. "Which measurement do you dispute?" "None." The answer arrived without hesitation. Then why request a revision? Professor Kryn touched the display, and a second image appeared beside the rotating planet. It showed Ethan Walker standing calmly inside the environmental simulation chamber, while laboratory sensors displayed stable physiological readings. Because we evaluated the world while overlooking the civilization that evolved with it. One council member leaned forward thoughtfully. A single cadet does not overturn generations of research. Professor Kryn remained composed. Neither does a single equation explain an entire species. She expanded the presentation. Comparative studies filled the air above the conference table. Human adaptation rates, long-term expedition records, recovery after unexpected environmental change, behavioral flexibility during uncertain conditions. Every chart pointed toward the same conclusion. Humanity consistently adapted faster when conditions shifted unexpectedly. Chancellor Solon studied the reports carefully. Your evidence suggests correlation. It suggests something stronger, Professor Kryn replied. The environment did not merely challenge humanity. It shaped humanity. Another researcher quietly raised a concern. Earth remains exceptionally hazardous by Academy standards. Professor Kryn agreed immediately. Yes. The researcher continued. Then warning cadets remains appropriate. Absolutely. Professor Kryn looked around the chamber. My concern is not that we described Earth as difficult. My concern is that we describe survival there as nearly impossible while ignoring the millions of people who proved otherwise every single day. The room fell silent. She continued in the same calm voice. Scientific integrity requires us to acknowledge all available evidence, including living evidence. She displayed a historical timeline showing thousands of years of human adaptation across deserts, forests, mountains, frozen landscapes, coastlines, and changing climates. Human civilization did not succeed because Earth eventually became easy. Humanity learned because Earth never did. Several council members slowly reread the revised conclusion printed within her report. Earth presents extraordinary environmental demands. Humanity represents an extraordinary long-term adaptive response to those demands. Chancellor Solon removed his glasses and looked through the crystal wall toward the academy below. Cadets from countless civilizations walked together across the central plaza, without realizing their morning classes had inspired a scientific debate above them. After several thoughtful moments, he turned back toward Professor Kryn. Yesterday, did the human cadet argue with your lecture? Professor Kryn smiled faintly. No. Did he attempt to embarrass you? No. Then what changed your mind? She answered quietly. He reminded me that evidence sometimes raises its hand. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Chancellor Solon closed the report and nodded once. Your revision will proceed to final review. Around the conference table, several researchers slowly followed his example. They were not abandoning science. They were allowing science to become more complete. As the meeting concluded, Professor Kryn gathered her papers and glanced once more toward the academy courtyard where Ethan Walker crossed the campus, carrying a stack of textbooks beneath one arm, greeting another student with an easy smile before disappearing into the morning crowd, completely unaware that his ordinary honesty had become the strongest piece of evidence inside an extraordinary room. 3 days later, the largest lecture hall in the Galactic Academy of Interstellar Sciences filled long before the scheduled class began. Word had quietly spread throughout the campus that Professor Selena Kryn had requested every first-year cadet attend a revised presentation on planetary adaptation. Students arrived carrying digital notebooks and curious expressions, expecting another technical lecture filled with familiar charts and environmental statistics. Ethan Walker entered with the rest of his classmates and selected his usual seat near the center of the hall. He noticed the atmosphere felt different. Instructors who rarely attended introductory courses now occupied the upper observation balcony. Several members of the Scientific Review Council stood quietly along the side walls. Even Chancellor Darius Solon had chosen to observe from the back of the room without ceremony. No announcements explained their presence. Professor Kryn stepped onto the circular platform precisely on schedule. Her silver academy uniform reflected the morning light streaming through the transparent dome, while a new holographic presentation slowly appeared behind her. Instead of beginning with environmental hazard classifications, the display showed only a single rotating image of Earth suspended against the darkness of space. No warning symbols surrounded it. No red indicators flashed beside its name. The professor looked across thousands of attentive faces before speaking. Science exists to pursue truth, even when truth asks us to reconsider what we believed yesterday. The lecture hall became perfectly silent. She touched the control panel beside her, and the old academy classification appeared for only a moment. Earth, Category 9, Survival Improbability. Then, with one deliberate movement, she dismissed the outdated conclusion. A revised document replaced it. Earth, High Adaptation Environment, Origin World of Humanity. Several cadets quietly leaned forward. Others immediately began recording the lecture. Professor Kryn continued with calm confidence. For many years, we measured the difficulty of this world with exceptional precision. We documented its gravity, climate, biology, geology, and atmosphere. Every measurement was correct. She paused briefly before looking toward the audience. Our mistake was believing those measurements alone explained the outcome. New charts appeared, displaying comparative research completed after the council review. Environmental pressure occupied one side of the display. Human adaptive development occupied the other. Instead of opposing one another, both lines rose together across thousands of years. Professor Kryn pointed toward the data. Human civilization did not flourish because Earth eventually became gentle. Humanity flourished because every generation learned to adapt when Earth refused to remain predictable. The enormous lecture hall remained completely quiet. Ethan lowered his eyes toward his notebook without writing a single word. He recognized many of the examples now appearing on the screen. Seasonal weather, mountain travel, coastal storms, changing landscapes. Everyday experiences from home had become scientific evidence inside one of the most respected academies in the Alliance. Professor Kryn then surprised everyone by stepping away from the presentation entirely. Cadet Ethan Walker. Ethan looked up immediately before standing. "Yes, Professor." She smiled warmly, a rare expression that many students had never seen before. "You changed this lecture without intending to." Ethan gently shook his head. "No, Professor. I only answered your question." A quiet ripple of understanding moved across the room. Professor Kryn nodded. "Exactly." She faced the assembled cadets once more. Knowledge grows strongest when observation remains more important than pride. The statement lingered beneath the crystal dome. No applause interrupted the silence. None was needed. Every student understood they had just witnessed something far more valuable than an ordinary revision of classroom material. They had watched a respected scientist publicly improve her own conclusions because new evidence deserved to be heard. Professor Kryn looked once more toward the rotating image of Earth. "Beginning today, every environmental adaptation course will teach not only the hazards of this remarkable world, but also the extraordinary civilization shaped by those hazards." Behind her, the holographic Earth continued, turning slowly beneath the Academy lights, no longer displayed as an impossible place to fear, but as the living cradle of a species whose greatest strength had never been surviving perfection. It had always been learning from change. 10 years later, the first lesson taught inside the Galactic Academy of Interstellar Sciences no longer began with a warning. It began with a question. Every new class assembled beneath the familiar crystal dome where generations of cadets had once stared at the rotating image of Earth with uncertainty. The Academy itself had grown larger over the years. New laboratories surrounded the original lecture hall. New civilizations had joined the Alliance. New discoveries had expanded the frontiers of science. Yet one tradition remained unchanged. At precisely 0800 hours on the opening day of every environmental adaptation course, the lights dimmed, The holographic projectors awakened, and a blue planet slowly appeared above the center of the room. Fresh cadets usually reacted the same way their predecessors once had. They admired the oceans. They studied the continents. They noticed the storms spiraling across entire oceans and the mountain ranges stretching beyond the clouds. Then they quietly examined the environmental data floating beside the planet. Gravity, atmospheric pressure, geological activity, biological diversity, seasonal instability. The numbers still seemed extraordinary. Nothing about the science had changed. Only the understanding behind it had. Professor Selena Kryn, now serving as Dean of Planetary Sciences, walked calmly onto the platform with the same composed confidence that had defined her career. Her silver hair reflected the morning light, while her pale gray eyes moved across another generation of curious students. Behind her, the holographic Earth continued turning in silent elegance. She allowed the room to become completely quiet before speaking. Many years ago, this academy taught that no cadet could survive on a world like this. Several students exchanged uncertain glances exactly as countless others had done before them. Professor Kryn smiled gently. Then one student quietly reminded us that science must always recognize living evidence. She touched the control console. Instead of displaying environmental warnings, the screen revealed a simple photograph. A young human cadet stood beside a laboratory simulation chamber wearing an ordinary Navy Academy uniform, smiling with quiet humility rather than triumph. No medals decorated his uniform. No dramatic pose suggested heroism. He simply looked like someone grateful to be learning. Professor Kryn continued. He never argued with the data. He simply reminded us that the data was incomplete. Around the lecture hall, thousands of new cadets listened in thoughtful silence. Some began taking notes. Others simply watched the image of the young human whose calm honesty had quietly changed an entire scientific discipline. Among the students sat young explorers from worlds of endless deserts, peaceful oceans, frozen valleys, floating cities, and distant moons. Each came from a different civilization, shaped by a different home. Yet every one of them suddenly understood that environments did more than test life. They helped create it. Beyond the lecture hall, another familiar figure crossed the academy courtyard beneath brilliant morning light. Commander Ethan Walker had returned as a guest lecturer after years of exploration across the Alliance. He still carried himself with the same quiet confidence. He still greeted maintenance workers before senior officers. He still paused to help a first-year cadet gather scattered books after an accidental drop without expecting anyone to notice. Some habits never changed because they had never been performances. They had simply become part of who he was. Later that afternoon, Ethan stood alone beneath the transparent observation dome, overlooking distant stars. Professor Kryn joined him without ceremony. For several peaceful moments, neither spoke. Together, they watched the blue planet projected above the academy slowly rotate against the darkness of space. Finally, Professor Kryn smiled. They still ask me what convinced me to rewrite the curriculum. Ethan looked toward the familiar image of Earth before quietly answering. What do you tell them? She folded her hands behind her back. I tell them that sometimes the greatest discovery in science is realizing that the evidence has been standing in front of you all along. Ethan smiled softly, but said nothing more. The stars drifted beyond the crystal dome exactly as they always had, silent witnesses to a truth that would outlive classrooms, textbooks, and even civilizations. The galaxy had spent generations measuring the difficulty of one remarkable world. It finally learned to measure the remarkable people that world had quietly shaped. And somewhere beneath drifting clouds, changing seasons, restless oceans, and endless skies, Earth continued doing what it had always done. It kept teaching ordinary people how to become extraordinary by simply calling them home.